Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for a recently finished Australian Survivor season. This time doing a player ranking for Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn II. We're here I'll obviously be ranking every player on the season based on how I feel like they played on the season. And again, jump straight into it. We obviously have 24 players to be ranking here. So at number 24, the person who I think played the worst game on this season ends up being Indy. Where I do feel like Indy is a player here that did almost everything wrong, seemingly. I mean, she's someone that actively waited early on before making any alliances. And again, that can work out for you. But it just felt like she was in a spot where, again, she allowed the people to play around her, but then proceeded to complain that they weren't involving her in things. Or once she does get involved in the Covenant Alliance, again, did seem to want to use her as a number and two fair. And obviously she was clearly on the bottom of that group. But again, that's not the worst thing in the world so early on in the game. When you're on a tribe of 12, yeah, she decides to just instantly blow that up and tell the men that she seemingly has no connection to that they're in danger. And again, weirdly threatens them to the point where we obviously see Rich and Max rat her back out to the people that they actually have connections to. And again, all this just felt like such a misguided play from Indy, to where I do feel like Indy's in this spot where she just self-sabotaged her game so much here, where if she just did nothing, she would have been fine. No one was targeting her. And again, there would have been so many other potential options instead of her. Again, Miles, Kent, Rich even, where again, it just felt like she just self-sabotaged her game for no reason. And I feel like that's what really makes her the worst here. The fact that her initial strategy was bad of, again, not really developing these alliances early on, then also blowing up the one alliance that does pull her in. I think Indy has a serious argument for being one of the worst players in all of Australian Survivors. So because of that, for me, Indy is here at number 24. Now, number 23, I guess a step above that. I guess, I mean, genuinely, the season has some pretty awful players at the bottom here. At 23, we do have Nash. And Nash is an interesting case here. I actually think Nash is a better player potentially than the next person we'll be talking about. Where I think the next person we'll be talking about is someone that, again, probably more inherently feels in line with Indy. Now, again, I think the one credit you would give to Nash is the fact that obviously he did steer that first vote. Again, he was the person that called out Candy's name. Candy does ultimately go home in a spot where actually the idol wasn't even necessary for that round. Where, again, it was going to be a 5-4-3. Where, again, ultimately ends up being a 5-4-3. And again, it seems like he had influence over Kate and Morgan from the flip their votes, even though they flip against him in the following round. But I think really the thing for me with Nash is that I also feel like he's another one that, again, he could have done nothing and he probably would have been fine. But instead, he decides to showcase his idol right away. Again, obviously not bad that he found the idol, but bad that he decides to tell everybody about his idol, putting this massive bullseye on his back. Where, again, naturally the plan was for him to go, where the majority of the tribe did want him out, but they just simply did not have the votes because they split the votes. Obviously, he ultimately ends up playing the idol, and that would have kept him safe anyway. But again, he essentially comes into this first tribal where the majority of the tribe actively wants him out of the game, which is so bad. Considering, again, especially considering how unprompted it is. It's literally just him doing this to himself. And he tries to utilize this idol to try to secure bonds that none of them actually stick true to. Or again, Kristen, Ursula never really fully trusted him and throw him under a bus at the first opportunity. Petey and Zen literally vote for him during that first round, where, again, it's just so bad. And obviously he gets taken out the following round, where in a near unanimous vote, where really the only votes that weren't against him were obviously split votes. Again, I'll at least give Nash credit for the fact that he at least tries. And again, he did actually get his target out during that first round. But again, the only reason he gets his target out during the first round is because of his idol, where if it had not been for his idol, the vote wouldn't have been split in the way that it was to allow him to even get his way there. As again, the majority of the tribe didn't want Andy to go, to where, again, I just think Nash plays this season also just so wrong. Or again, I think his ability to at least get the Candy vote to go through and have some people around him makes him a potentially better player than the next person we'll be talking about. But again, I think the fact that he was actually meant to be going out in that first round and likely would have if he did not have that idol and just put such a big bullseye on his back, I think for me is good enough to put him a spot below that other person at number 23. Now, number 22. Another really bad player. Another one of the worst players in Australian Survivor history. At 22, we do have Kent. And again, Kent, as I said, I think is potentially a worse player than Nash. I think Kent is someone that just seemed to come into the game with everything also just wrong. Again, came into the game burning Max's hat for no reason. And then, again, credit to him at least the fact that he did end up, again, trying to put this bullseye onto Miles. And it did seem somewhat effective to where Miles did seem to get this bullseye on his back because of this. So, again, at least there's some credit to give him for that. Also, again, he survives a tribal over Indy, mind you, but still survives that tribal. Didn't seem to be a target during that round at any point. So, again, at least there's that. Everything else, pretty bad. Again, never was in a true alliance, always on the bottom. Also, him just exposing the fact for no reason that he burned Max's hat, and also exposing the fact that he did it to throw the target onto Miles is kind of insane. Like, why did he do that? Which obviously that puts a bigger bullseye in his back the following round. And to be fair, I think he was always like kind of on the bottom of that tribe, where I think no matter what, the women would want him out pretty soon afterwards anyway. And he never was able to cultivate this relationship with Miles either way. To where, again, I don't think he was particularly long for the game either way. But again, definitely a spot where he just further burned his relationships for no real reason. But again, he ends up getting to his boot round where really no one really wanted him to stay. I mean, I know AJ, again, tried to put together his plan to take out Logan and did seem to look at Kent as a shield for him, but again, it didn't really seem to be based around anything super concrete. And again, even then, Kent was going after Miles, who's someone that clearly AJ prioritized more, to where I don't really feel like Kent really had much lasting power on this season. I think he, again, put that massive bullseye on his own back. But again, in this comparison between him and Nash, specifically on how this season plays out, he survived the tribal naturally. Now, again, bad play outside that. Again, also, I didn't even mention the fact that he, like, took a nap during the scrambling in episode 2. That's also pretty insane. But there's a lot bad. But there's a lot bad with all three of these bottom people. I think these are three of legitimately the worst players in Australian Survivor history. So, again, while I do think Nash, again, getting his way that one time is at least something to give him credit for, again, in a general player ranking, the fact that he can demonstrate that level of influence, I do think when it comes to this ranking here, in terms of how they played on this season, I feel like the fact that Nash was, again, supposed to be that first boot, while Kent wasn't really brought up as a potential first boot option, I think it's something to give a minor edge to Kent here. So again, he's here at number 22. Now number 21, and here we're getting to kind of a new sub-tier of the list, where again, those bottom three were like pretty easy to pick out. I think from this point, I think these next few people, again, there's a lot of debate between these people, but at number 21, I'm going to go for a player that I think was also really bad. While they made it a bit further into the game, they probably shouldn't have, and that person is Rich. And Rich is a player here that, again, like, I think on paper, you would think of him as, like, a bad player, obviously, still. Again, the fact that he was very abrasive and had the women actively against him. But I think initially you would think, again, he makes it somewhat deep into the game. He also, again, seemed to have, again, this bomb squad alliance around him. I think a problem is the fact that the bomb squad never seemed primed for success. Probably never really get to see the alliance truly tested out. He obviously ends up getting voted out at that tribal where he gets into the other tribe. But again, initially you would think, okay, that's under the context of him being sent to the other tribe. Where again, in the edit, it did seem like the votes were still up in the air and Laura could have potentially sided with them. But it has come out in Extra Press that, yeah, he probably was just going home. So again, I think that's a major knock against there. The fact that he essentially gets saved by Anonalim then in that spot. And spot where, again, this alliance they had cultivated around him was never actually real and never was actually going to be generally loyal to him, with Miles in particular being someone that was pretty anti the alliance. So I think something to give him credit for is the fact that he did survive 3 tribals. And he does survive those tribals largely on the back of the fact that he had this relationship with Laura in particular that, again, I think give him a lot of credit for. The problem is that also he had almost everyone else in the game not wanting him in the game, where, again, the fact that even Logan, even someone that he was supposed to have this really close relationship to, was very much willing to let him go. And beyond that, also had Arn and Zara and Ali all actively want him out because of how terrible he was around camp. There again, I think that is all very bad. But while he obviously technically survives those 2 tribals at the beginning where Indy and Kent go home, it's a spot where, again, he was technically the wanted target for the majority of the players there, and was just kind of fortunate that he made one specific very influential ally in Laura that ended up keeping him in the game. And I think also his final round is very bad. The fact that, again, he's on this swap tribe that he does technically have the majority on, yet he plays that so sloppily and is, again, just a sloppy player in general that allows for him to be taken out as this potential swing vote, with just no one really wanting to keep him around. Not his original brains, not the new bronze he met on the other side. To where, again, I just think all around, Rich's game is pretty atrocious. I think really the main selling point for him would be the fact that, again, he at least does survive those first couple tribals, but even then, I would not necessarily give him that much credit, considering even then, it's not even like he's in a majority group. He's kind of just dangling on in the game and really played the game just all wrong up to that point. So again, for me, Rich is here number 21. Now, number 20, kind of similar thing, ultimately was meant to survive over Rich, and that player is Ali. And again, Ali also, really atrocious player. Again, the fact that she's like very domineering around camp, the fact that she gets into these arguments with AJ, the fact that she comes off very demeaning, the fact that she openly spills information to the bronze. Again, all this very, very bad. But again, in comparison to Rich, it's very close. Actually, originally I did have Ali lower than Rich. Rich obviously ends up technically surviving over her. And again, initially, based on the edit, it did feel like Ali was going home over Rich had that one tribal actually played out. Though again, with the post-game press and now knowing that that wasn't the case, Ali's above Rich. Realistically, I don't think they're that dissimilar of players. They're both around the same caliber, both very confrontational, both people that people just don't want to work with and just easy people to take out. and both also survived a decent amount of tribals. Where really, again, that tiebreaker for me was it really, again, that non-elimination tribal. Now, again, I think at least something to give Allie credit for more so than Rich, the fact that it did seem like Coven was real at a point, where, again, in comparison to Rich's bomb squad, it felt like that alliance was never really going to stick together. The Coven, at least, it seemed like it was going to stick together at a point. Also, at the time that she ends up going home, she's not taking out an unanimous vote like Rich. She's taken out in a 4-3 vote, where realistically, I mean, obviously, that was a vote that was very wonky with Max's advantage, and was actually a spot where Allie was meant to go home anyway. After a while, again, you can maybe mention the concept of her being twist screwed. That's not really the reality, considering, again, she was meant to go home anyway, and Max screwed up the advantage to essentially stop her from being saved by a twist, which is kind of humorous. But really, in general, again, Allie had a group at a point, and also would have survived over Rich during the on a limb tribal, where it's barely anything, but it is enough to put her here at number 20. Now, number 19, moving on to another player I think is pretty bad. I actually debated if this should have been worse than the last two, considering this is a person that theoretically should have been the first boot. Or had it not been for something completely out of control, she would have been the first boot. But she does survive a few more tribals, and again, makes it slightly deeper into the game than both Rich and Allie. And that person is Ursula. And again, Ursula is one that I think you can debate having her lower. Again, she is someone that, again, was supposed to be the first boot. Had things played out naturally, again, according to the plan from the majority alliance, Ursula was going to be that first boot, as again, they expected Nash to play his idol, and through that, Ursula had been taken out due to the split vote. Now, obviously, that doesn't happen, as Kate and Morgan flip. Again, I don't really think Ursula had much of an impact on her own on getting them to flip, where, again, we see Nash trying to pull them over, but also I think, like, the concept of physical strength and needing Ursula for challenges also played a factor, where, again, I think that's a point where I don't really give Ursula that much credit for swinging that vote in that direction, and I do dock it against her the fact that, again, she was technically meant to be the first boot under the context of Nash playing his idol, which is what he did. So again, I think that's something to definitely criticize Ursula's game for. Now, beyond that, again, she does effectively throw Nash under the bus and get him voted out next. Mind you, again, it was always going to happen, and also, even then, she gets criticized by the others for not making relationships with them, which obviously is a major criticism in general of Ursula. The fact that she never really seemed to broaden out outside of her alliance, and through that, again, it led to this position where the others just generally didn't want to work with her because she didn't really try with them. And then we get to the swap where obviously she survives that first tribal where Rich ends up going home, but even then she's voting for Nunan for no reason. And then we get to her boot round, which I will say actually in her boot round, I actually don't think she plays it entirely wrong. Now, again, her entire attitude towards Nunan and her caginess there, I think is bad. But in terms of like her actual plan, like her plan was to stick with the bronze at that point, which I do think was the optimal play. And it's actually something, again, kind of the decision maker here on where she lands on this list. The fact that I actually think she had the right idea during her boot round. It just didn't really work out for her because Nunan just had so little trust in her, which again, obviously still faults her for that. But again, in comparison to Rich and Allie, who I don't think really had any real point where I really agree with their strategic decision making or actually thought that they were particularly effective, I think Ursula, again, at least is someone that I think is probably a slightly better strategic player, which again, isn't much credit to really give here. But again, I think that is the decision maker here in a spot where, again, they all have pretty atrocious games. We're all meant to be taken out in the pre-swap at some point, but all still, again, survived some tribals, made it probably deeper than they should have. But either way, Ursula, again, I think is slightly good enough to be here, number 19. Now, number 18. Again, we're a fourth of the way through the list, and we're finally getting to the first boot. We got Candy. And I debated Candy here a bit, just because, again, Candy obviously is the first boot. And through that, again, it's tough to really justify her being this high on the list. But the reality is, like, when thinking about her game, I don't think she did that much wrong. Again, looking at the likes of Rich, the likes of Allie, the likes of Ursula, where while they obviously survive over Candy, I feel like they're in a spot where they do so much more wrong than Candy does. Where I think for a first boot, I think Candy might be one of the best first boots in Survivor history. I don't think she does that much actively wrong. She had the majority alliance on her side. The problem is that obviously the alliance had to split their vote because Nash found the idol. And then once the vote was split, it allowed for the opportunity for Kate and Morgan to swing their votes. But even then, I think that was more so a thing to save Ursula for physical challenges, more so than anything that Candy necessarily did wrong. Now, obviously, I think there's criticisms we had in terms of how they split the vote. They could have done that a bit better, split the vote in a way that was more secure, that wouldn't mess up in the conditions of certain people flipping. But still, it's like, I feel like for first boot here, Candy plays not particularly poorly. Again, she had the majority of her tribe on her side, and just very unfortunate the fact that an idol was in play here that allowed for the situation to really flip on her. Where again, had this been a natural vote, or again, had the idol not been in play, she technically had most people wanting her to stay. Again, it also feels like she was largely targeted because she was looked at as a physical liability, or like anything she actually did wrong. So again, I don't feel like Candy did that much wrong here to be a first boot, to where again, in comparison to the people we've talked about so far, for a while Candy obviously didn't make it as far as them, she also again just did less wrong in the game. I think everyone we've talked about so far has been in atrocious player. Me having so many different things I can call them out for things they did wrong. I don't think there's that much wrong I can call out for Candy here. So again, that's a major reason why she's still here, number 18. Now, number 17, moving on to a player that is also weird in the rank here because this person didn't really get to finish out their game. But at 17, I do have Zen. And again, I debated Zen a lot here just because I think Zen is someone that seemed to have potential. Again, he seemed to have a lot of people on his side. Again, people were genuinely very emotional when he left the game, and it did seem like he had cultivated some pretty strong relationships to where, again, I don't think he would have been taken out anytime soon. The thing is, though, with Zen, though, is that I think there's a lot of red flags with Zen as a player to where, while, again, he seemed to be in the middle, and, again, we see him be loved by most, he also, again, like, literally flips against Nash at this first vote in a spot where Nash shows him his idol right away and literally has him towards the top of his priorities as an alliance member, and despite that, Nash just wants him out, one of the few people to vote for him during that first vote, and then beyond that talks about wanting to blindside Nash, only never get the opportunity, which it's, again, like, why exactly? And to be fair, obviously there's things that get cut out of the edit to where there's certain relationships I'm sure he had that we didn't really get to see. But I do feel like a lot of his strategic decision making did feel very questionable, especially considering just how hectic he ends up playing here. And we do see him again doing some things with Nash that, again, should not play well like socially. The fact that him and Nash just like openly go off on their own right after coming back to Tribal in episode 1. Where I think there's a lot of red flags with Zen and him just probably not being that great of a player, but we just never really got to see it play out. And again, it's just this unknown that makes him a bit tough to assess here. But really, in general, I don't really have much faith in Zen as a player. He screams out as the type of player that probably would be taken out at some point in the post swap, but again, we just really don't know. And because again, it's very tough to really gauge him, but I did feel like having him again a spot above Candy, who also got taken out in some very weird circumstances. I thought that was fair enough, so I put him here at number 17. Now, number 16, moving on to a player that I debated where this person should be for a while. I thought for a good chunk of it that she should be closer to likes of Rich and Allie and Ursula, and the fact that I think this player made a lot of mistakes in the game, but I also think there are some decent enough aspects of this person's game. And at number 16, I do have Max. And again, Max, I think, is a player that I think you have this lasting impact of him being a pretty bad player. The fact that he gets taken out with an idol in his pocket when he was in the minority, the fact that he obviously completely misplays that advantage. Again, has this big blindside of Miles lined up, only to instead himself get blindsided by the end result of that is, again, all really insane. That being said, though, I think there's at least like some good things to credit with Max. First, in the fact that I think he was relatively safe on his original tribe, where does not really talk about targeting him until after Rich had left, where before that, again, he always had Rich as a potential shield for him. Also, again, genuinely survived 3 tribals during that phase of the game. Now, again, he does start to get targeted during that penultimate round before the swap. And again, I think you could definitely argue the fact that he might have gotten saved by getting that advantage, where it did seem like the graduates were considering targeting him over Allie at that spot, but obviously don't by the end because of his advantage. But I just still think it's a world where Max did seem to have a lot of allies. It did seem like people genuinely wanted to work with Max, particularly like Logan seemed to have a good relationship with him. And also Allie, even though, again, he wanted Allie out. So, again, that's definitely something to criticize. But either way, again, like I think he had some decent relationships in that portion of the game. And in the post-swap, again, I actually don't think he plays it poorly. Like, while Ozzy backfires on him and he's taken out with an idol in his pocket, I actually feel like he actually plays those rounds pretty decently. Like, in a spot where you don't really trust anybody from your original brains, I think him latching onto the Brawn and just kind of hoping for the merge is not a terrible strategy. Now, obviously, he gets very unfortunate and Miles having an idol, which allows for all this to kind of backfire on him. But again, in a world where Miles does have an idol, I think Max is in a pretty decent position. At that point, he is, again, able to work with the likes of Jesse and Ben. And while obviously it's not out of the realm possibility that the vote could have flipped on him afterwards, considering the Girls Gone Wilder alliance comes together, I do think he implements, again, a not bad strategy of just trying to survive for the merge and then pick up the pieces from there. Where I think it really just ends up being a very unlucky circumstance for him, the fact that Miles has that idol, which allows everything to backfire on him. But really, again, I think it's a mixed game here. Again, I think Max obviously has a lot of strategic fallacies across the game. He's not the greatest player in the world, but I can at least redeem a couple aspects of his game to where, again, in comparison to the likes of Rich and Allie and Ursula, who just have pretty much outright atrocious games, where again, I feel like Max is, again, a step above that. I do think he was, again, safer for a lot of the game. He at least had some allies, and he had the right idea at a point. So, again, I think that's good enough for him to be here at number 16. Now, number 15, we're moving on to a player that made it deeper into the game. I knew they shouldn't have. And at number 15, we do have Jesse, the merge boot, though, again, should have been taken out really the round after Max, where Gets saved by a non-limb there, but really should have been taken out in the pre-merge where it obviously gets saved by a non-limb. But in general, like, Jesse's like a seemingly fine player in a sense that, again, it seemed like he was on the initial majority on the Brawn tribe. Again, it seemed like he had this alliance with, again, obviously Ben, but also like Paulie and Nunan and Candy and Kate and Morgan. Obviously things kind of blow up by the end of that first tribal, but even then, it's able to stay within the majority for the Nash vote. Gets to swap and initially really just stonewalled the remaining players to where, yeah, I think Jesse plays a lot into that culture. Now, mind you, again, you can debate how good it necessarily is, as again, obviously the brains held resentment for that. But again, it seemed to initially keep the Brawn together. Mind you, I think that is kind of where the issues from his game fall. The fact that obviously Kate and Morgan end up flipping on him to where they were willing to take him out before the swap. That's very bad. Also beyond that, the fact that he picks up Max as a number just to drop Max at almost the first instant is also very bad. I can at least get it in the fact that obviously like Max in that position is still very untrustworthy. It's tough to trust him. And this is the first time that trust is being tested there to where, again, the fact that they put the vote on Max as, again, this safer vote is understandable. I do still think it is probably the wrong call for Jesse in particular, though, who, again, could have picked up Max as a pretty integral number for him, but simply doesn't. And really just in general, I do think there's a lot of red flags with Jesse as a player. The fact that he was just so open with his alliances, the fact that he was just openly talking about how he wants the Bronze to stay together on the other tribe, and it really just felt like Jesse just had no awareness of how he was being perceived by the others, and I think that's obviously a major issue. Now, I will also say that I do think coming into the merge, well, again, he shouldn't have been in it to begin with, I do think he is very disfavored by the fact that Ben just left the game. Again, his number one ally taken out of the game, which puts him in a worse position coming to merge. Mind you, again, I think he was probably screwed either way. But again, still something that, again, very unfortunate for his game that he loses out on his number one ally. And then followed by that, again, just taking out the merge. Very unceremonious, just very clear target to where, and just in general, again, like Jesse's really here, kind of just representative of his game. Again, step above Max, the control at a point, lost that control, would have been taken out of the tribal that his tribe went to after Max's, to where, again, it's a step above him, but not particularly great still. But again, good enough to be here, number 15. Now, number 14. We're moving on to a player that made it pretty deep. The first juror on the board here, we're moving on to Paulie. And again, I think Paulie played a pretty bad game. Now, again, in comparison to Jesse, obviously very similar early on. Again, they're both in the majority, in the same alliance during the early days of Brawn. Mind you, in that, again, still some weird play from him and like hiding his idol from Nunan, which I felt was not particularly necessary, especially in him doing it in a pretty sketchy way, as it, again, could have easily backfired on him. But again, still like decent enough play during that portion of the game. Gets the swap, and again, gets a very unfortunate swap. And again, this is really the big moment for his game. The fact that from that point forward, he just gets very unlucky, and the fact that he's on the bottom there, comes to the merge down numbers, and really is never able to really recuperate following that. He really is just clinging on to the game from that point forward. Mind you, obviously, he does need an idol play along the way to survive. He would have gone home when Nunan went home and not had an idol. That's something to criticize. Also, just really had no real agency throughout that entire portion of the game, especially considering, again, he could have saved Nunan. He did not need to vote out Nunan, but just actively votes out his number one ally for like no reason. Beyond that, though, I will say, again, I think he at least had the right idea at a point. Again, he was really the main person trying to keep the Bronze together, and I think that's at least something to give him credit for, as I do think, again, that was the correct play. The problem is obviously keeping all those people together, which didn't seem like a practicality. So again, I think that's obviously a criticism there, but still, I do think he had the right idea at a point, but just was never able to really gain any traction. And then once we get to the merge, again, once again, blindside when Jesse goes out, was supposed to be voted out again, only to get saved by an idol again. The spot where Miles doesn't even save him because he actually wanted to keep Paulie in the game, was more so just because he wanted a big move on his resume. And following that is, once again, just kind of on the bottom, while he wouldn't have been voted out when Laura ends up going home. And also, again, probably ends up staying at the Baron Bounty vote. Had been a normal tribal, he still was just such an expendable number. And while obviously he gets technically idled out of the game, it was a spot where just no one really wanted him around and no one really trusted him in the game. And again, it's just very tough to assess Paulie as a whole here. I do feel like he just has a very lacking game, but one that, again, is all based around the concept that he essentially got swap screwed, to where, again, I still do think I have to assess him low, just because, again, he literally gets saved by 2 idols across his run and never really gained any traction, to where, again, at the end of the day, I do have him here number 14. Now, number 13. Continuing on with the stretch of idled out players, we got Nunan. And again, Nunan's in this weird spot here where obviously, like, considering her placement on the season, she is relatively high here, again, above Jesse and Paulie, who both made it farther than her. But I think obviously the big thing with Nunan here is the fact that she gets idled out in a spot where Paulie was meant to go home. And through that, and also, again, Paulie's game beyond that not being particularly good, I think it fundamentally means that Nunan should be higher than Paulie. Now, I think there are arguments against that. First, the fact that it did seem like Paulie had more connections with the OG Bronze than Nunan did, where, again, we obviously see this like fracture between her and Ursula in particular. And again, the entire handling of that relationship, I think, is pretty bad from Nunan's point of view. Mind you, I do think Nunan does a better job at building bonds with the OG brains. Where, again, I think she had a better relationship with AJ. Mind you, she blows that up, and that's also a criticism. Despite that, actually, though, again, was not meant to go home. She was, again, just the split vote. And in that world, again, I still think it's a spot where I would still have her above Paulie. Again, it seemed like everyone was kind of annoyed by Paulie. No one genuinely wanted to work with him. I think Nunan at least had people that wanted to work with her at a point, and also, again, never genuinely got the majority of the votes against her, which Paulie got twice across the season. So I think that's like something to definitely give Nunan credit for. Now, early on in the game, again, and again, just like Paulie, just like Jesse, she was in the same alliance early on. Mind you, again, I think she probably is more at fault, to be fair, alongside Paulie, for how they split the vote during that first tribal, where, and considering Candy was a very close ally of hers, I think she probably should have done a little bit more to really secure Candy staying in the game. But really, outside that, again, there's not really that big of a difference between her and Paulie, outside the fact that, again, she was meant to survive over Paulie. That's where I think Nunan, again, had some questionable decision-making at points, throwing AJ under the bus, also throwing Ursula under the bus. I do feel like it was a game that was meant to go a little bit further had it not been for an idol. So again, I think that's good enough to put her here at number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to another player that got idled out again, and that player is PD. And straight up, PD is a player I really did not know what to do with, just because obviously we didn't see much of PD's game. We really don't know where he was in the game most of the time, and that makes it very tough to assess him. Now, actually, genuinely, in the comparison between him and Nunan, I think there's actually a major argument for Nunan being higher. Again, Nunan was in that initial majority alliance. She was seemingly a very integral number within the majority alliance. And PD was kind of seemingly more on the outs, more so on the Nash side of things, where while he, again, votes for Nash at that first tribal and eventually votes for Nash when he ends up going home, I don't think it was a spot where PD was particularly well connected on the OG Brawn. So again, I think that's definitely something to dock against him there. Also, I don't think he particularly uses his time on new brains particularly well, where we don't really see him building any bonds with anybody outside of his group. And even within his group, again, he's not particularly well positioned, where while it did seem like he was kind of a lackey for Ben and Jesse, I don't know how true that necessarily was, considering he ends up voting out Jesse, where again, I doubt he was really that close to them in the grand scheme of things, but just kind of there. And again, I do criticize him for seemingly not building tons of people outside that and kind of just stonewalling the brains there. Again, at the end of the day, it's like we just don't really get to see much of him. But once we get to the merge, again, we see him flip right away. And it seemed like his game was maybe on a little bit of an uptick. Again, it seemed like he had this duo with Kristen and AJ wanted to work with him. But again, we get to his boot round where obviously he gets idled out, which again, definitely a bit unlucky there, especially considering Kristen had an idol that she supposedly was willing to play on him. So again, I think he does get unlucky in that situation. However, it's also a spot where he's getting idled out by people that he spent a lot of time with post-swap. And I think that is something that's kind of tough to reconcile here, is that, again, PD definitely had this opportunity to save himself here. Again, there were so many people to potentially put the votes on, and the fact that PD just never really cultivated that relationship with Miles to get Miles to want to save him. Also, again, Laura was the one that really put this PD vote into motion initially, and she was also somebody that he spent a lot of time with, where, again, the fact that PD had this room to maneuver with these people in particular and was never really able to do much with that, I think is definitely something I will criticize from PD. But again, he also still does make it pretty deep into the game. Again, the final pre-juror here in a spot where, again, he's idled out of the game, in a spot where he's idled out because of the knowledge is power, where obviously Miles did have another idol, but I don't think Miles is playing that one idol to take out PD if he only had that one idol. I think it is a spot where I think he is kind of unfortunate, the fact that Miles had two idols to play with here, and particularly had this knowledge is power idol in a spot where he's essentially incentivized to utilize it right after he steals it, to where I do think the entire circumstances around how he gets out of the game is, again, unlucky for him. But again, I think it is kind of a close debate between him and Nunan. I think Nunan actually does probably more well across the season, but PD obviously makes it further. PD also has a bit of a stranger idling out than Nunan. Also, it's not like Nunan played this like incredible game either, where Nunan also, again, mismanaged certain relationships along the way. So again, I think it is pretty close, but I do think the longevity for PD and the wonkiness of him being idled out is, again, enough to put him here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're actually finally wrapping up the pre-jurors of this list. At number 11, I do have Ben. And Ben is very difficult to rank here. Obviously, we have Ben leaving the game unpromptedly. Again, still don't 100% know what exactly happened there. So with that in mind, it's just a bit difficult to rate Ben, as we just don't know how his game would have played out. Now, obviously, by the time he ends up going home, he did seem to be on the bottom of his tribe in the sense that Kate and Morgan were willing to flip against Jesse, and while obviously it was on Jesse and not him, that would assumedly mean that he's probably the next to go following that. And Ben's another one that, again, I think there are like red flags to Ben as a player. The fact that he seemed like kind of cold when talking to people, like had these like weird interactions with AJ I don't think are great. Mind you, outside that, it's just, we don't have much of him on the show. So again, it's just tough to gauge Ben here. But again, he was in the majority alliance really for most of his run. Again, literally on the original Brawn tribe, obviously in the majority alliance. Post swap, stays in the majority alliance until the point where the vote was going to flip on Jesse. Even beyond that, recognized the fact that the vote was flipping on Jesse and tried to get the vote back in his favor, which again, I'll give him some credit for there. Also, the fact that Ben did seem to be a very strategically minded player. Again, like obviously he is a fan of the show. We see him again be willing to throw challenges. Where again, for a big muscly guy like him, you wouldn't necessarily expect that. To where again, I think Ben is someone that again definitely had some skills for the game. And again, it's a spot where you just don't know how his game would have played out. Realistically, again, had he survived, he likely probably just is like the second boot after the merge or something after Jesse goes. But we never know. And I think it's just again tough to really gauge Ben's game at this point where we don't really have all the information. So I think in this world, we saw at least some positives from him also being in a majority for almost the entire first half of the game. So I think that is good enough to put him here at number 11. Now number 10, and at number 10, we're moving on to a player that I thought had a lot of skills for the game, did not really do the most with it by the end. At number 10, we do have Logan. And again, Logan is a player that obviously seemed to have a lot of potential. I mean, she's someone that on the original Brawn tribe seemed to have a lot of influence. I mean, she seemed to be, alongside Laura, very influential within the Coven, had a lot of influence in keeping Rich around, also had a good relationship with Max that doesn't ultimately lead to anything, but again, did have Max as someone that genuinely wanted to work with her. Mind you, again, couldn't really control Max, but again, at least was in a spot where Max was never going to go for Logan. But again, I think early on in the pre-swap, had a lot of influence there. Towards the end of the post-swap, she ends up losing the Coven members, but even then was never talked about as a target from that point on, and then gets a pretty unfortunate swap, again, getting swapped away from all of her allies, to where while the Brains had a majority, it was all the Brains that she kind of had severed ties with, to where the fact that she was able to recover in that position and still maintain a majority, I thought was pretty good. Mind you, again, definitely Kristen, the fact that she definitely loses agency during that portion of the game. She doesn't really have much say over how things go, but I still feel like the fact that, again, she at least is in the majority is at least something to credit her for. Now, mind you, I think once we get to the merge, I think she plays pretty poorly, where obviously, again, she does end up making the right call and taking out Jesse before taking a shot at one of her own, but again, her really trying to strong arm people in the game with Paulie, that seemed unnecessary. I don't think it's really a big difference between Paulie and PD for her. Also, obviously needs an idol at the final 11 round. She was going to be taken out there, gets saved by her own idol. In a spot where, again, at least credit to her and having a relationship with Karen, where Karen wanted to save her, but still a spot where the majority of the tribe wanted her out. And really, that's the way it goes for most of the post-merge. It didn't seem like she had this massive target on her back, and really had a massive target on her back for most of the season. It felt like a lot of people were talking about Logan and Laura as this major alliance that needed to be split up. Though I always felt like Logan's pretty poised to be taken out at some point around this point. Then obviously ends up surviving because of her idol. And again, once again gets saved by Karen at the following vote, where Paulie goes, so I give credit to that. But then we get to the point where she decides to take reins of the game and take out Karen, which is really stupid. And again, I think this is a major thing I'll criticize her for. I think this is just such an idiotic move to go for Karen in this spot. Again, Karen, the person that was saving her over the last couple rounds. For a while, I get the fact that she was feeling manipulated by Karen. I do still think it's a spot where Karen was a much more reliable ally for her than, again, someone like Miles, someone like AJ, who she had a feud with for a while at this point, where, again, I think it is just kind of insane that she leads the charge, at least in her mind, against Karen. Mind you, again, Karen vote probably would have happened even without her, but again, she actively pushed for this vote thinking she was the mastermind of it, and I think that is also very bad. Now, I will give her credit for in her boot round, where while, again, I obviously criticize the fact that she kind of gave up by the end, I do think the fact that she even got Morgan, Kate, and Kristen to vote alongside her is actually pretty impressive there, especially considering they didn't really have much connective tissue before that point, to where, again, I think that is something I will definitely give Logan some credit for, to where, again, Logan's not a bad player. While she is lower on this ranking than her actual placement, I do feel like she had a lot of skills for the game. I just think, again, I think she has some sloppy strategic play at points, didn't really have a lot of influence at points, and then at other points, really strong-armed people in a way that really turned them off. Also, again, needing an idol at a point, in particular in comparison to the next person we talk about. So again, I think at the end of the day, Logan's game is faulted enough here to drop to number 10 here. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that, again, got taken out from an idol play, and definitely not a lot of those on this season. Number 9, though, we have Laura. And again, Laura and Logan, I don't think there's that big of a difference between their games, where obviously like initially they were working together. I don't really feel like there's a major difference there between Laura and Logan, outside the fact that Laura was more gung-ho about keeping Rich around and was able to do that for longer than Logan, where Logan kind of gave up on that early on. But again, Laura got more of her way for early on. Mind you, I think Laura also has the issues that Logan has in strong-arming a bit too much. Again, during the round where Rich gets sent to the other tribe, that was a spot where I think she probably fought too much to keep Rich, which ended up kind of backfiring on her. But even beyond that, again, still was never talked about as a target. People still did seem to want to work with Laura. But ultimately, she ends up getting a very unfortunate swap where she has very little agency across the swap phase of the game. But even then, I think she had the right idea. Again, for her in the game, I think sticking with the brains, trying to pull off this big vote with Miles's idol, again, I think was the correct play. And again, if only Max would have stayed on board, again, they would have been able to do something there. Though obviously, again, it ultimately fails at that. But even then is able to get Kate and Morgan to flip to her side. Jesse would have gone home at that one tribal, to where again, I at least give her some credit there. Mind you, obviously we got the entire thing with Zara over the tribe swap, and again, she plays that sloppily, but I wouldn't necessarily dock Laura points for that, especially considering it's not like she was ever going to be voted out genuinely in that spot, to where again, I don't think it's really that big of an issue. And again, once we get to the merge, she's playing alongside Logan until she ends up orchestrating this vote against PD, which felt like something that she did get the numbers for. It felt like something she could actually put into motion and would have actually been pretty decent for her game, seemingly. But obviously, Logan shuts it down. And that's at least a point where, again, Logan has influence over her. But it's a spot where I do think Laura at least had influence in the game to actually make this move happen if she wanted it to. But then we get to obviously her boot round, where, again, she's pretty aloof during that entire round. But again, she was the secondary target. Logan was the initial target. She gets taken out because of Logan's idol play. After a while, again, I think you obviously still fault her. For being pretty aloof of what's going on there, I would not fault her more than Logan, who was supposed to be taken out in that spot. While, again, Logan, had Karin warn her. Again, clearly Laura did not have the connection with Karin to get Karin to save her, but to be fair, I think there's other factors in there, and obviously the fact they swapped with Logan and not Laura, and also the fact that Logan was again a bit more of a shield than Laura, to where again, I think Laura gets pretty unfortunate in the way that she ends up going out here, to where while I do think again she could have managed her threat level, especially the threat level for her and Logan as a duo, a bit better on the season. I do think at the end of the day, I do think Laura played better than Logan for most of the season, to where while Logan did make it deeper into the game, and again I think that was something I very much debated here between Laura and Logan. As again, I think it makes it pretty close. I ultimately still decided to go with Laura, especially considering I feel like Laura got a lot more of her way early on in the game. I think it was playing a bit more optimally for probably more of the game than Logan. But again, it is really close, especially with that final round of Logan getting to a deadlock. But again, I still end up going with Laura at number 9 here. Now number 8. And at number 8, we have a player that I think was a pretty influential player for a lot of the season. The problem is I don't really agree with how they use their influence, and even then, they didn't necessarily use their actual influence too often. But either way, at number 8, we do have Karin. And again, Karin's a player that, again, was obviously a big player on this season. She was like big threat that had to be taken out mid-merge. It was kind of looked at as like this mastermind from her fellow players, while also being very well positioned up to that point, to where, again, on paper, Karin's game is very, very good. Again, she starts off with the initial majority with the Coven, then is able to flip over to the graduates and form a new majority. Once we get to the swap, she once again is in the majority there for really the entire ride. And then we get to the merge where she's once again in the majority, to where, again, she's really in the majority the entire time. And that's something I definitely would give her credit for. The question is, again, what does she do within that majority? And I think that is the thing that, again, makes me qualm with her a bit here. Again, the fact that I think obviously initially she lets Laura get a bit too much power. The fact that she just the fact that, again, she very much wants Rich out, yet despite that doesn't really ever take the shot at Rich because of Laura's will. And then it takes them 3 rounds before being able to actually get the vote onto Rich. Also in the post swap, it felt like AJ was doing a lot of things that Karin didn't really want him to do, and she wasn't able to really keep him in line for that. Also through that, she's also like considering taking out AJ, and that felt very misguided at that point in the game, with AJ still being a reliable number for her. And I think the disintegration between her relationship with AJ is really a lot on her. For a while, I think AJ would have targeted her as this threat in the game at some point down the road. I do think he would have been pretty willing to work with her had she just pretended to not be upset at him. And I do think she, again, let her emotions get a bit too into the game. Just kind of allowed her annoyances with people just become a bit too blatant. And I think that is definitely a criticism of her game. Also, criticism of her game is the fact that she constantly tried to make things happen at Tribal, where, again, she ends up having these pretty insane plots. Again, the fact that she wanted to make it like a 4-3 vote during that penultimate tribal before the merge to spook AJ is just so idiotic. And while again, I do agree with her move to keep Logan around, I think Logan is a better ally for her than Laura. I think she did it a bit too blatantly where people picked up on the fact that she told Logan. Also, she obviously just did not manage Logan well enough to where despite the fact that she saved Logan the game, Logan just flips on her on a whim a few rounds later, which is bad. And really in general, in her boot round, obviously she plays that all wrong. The fact that she had the information to save herself and just simply doesn't, instead implodes her game at tribal is just insanely bad. Mind you, I will at least give her credit for the fact that she had the bond with Kristen to where Kristen at least told her about the vote. Again, the fact that she even had this opportunity to save herself is something I will give her credit for, but also it's a major ding against her for not taking that opportunity and instead just blowing up her game despite that. And again, I think it's really the spot where Karin has a lot of skills for the game. She was able to stay in the majority for a lot of the game, was able to maneuver through the game in a very dynamic way. I just think, again, the issue is that I do think strategically she made a lot of missteps and simply just did not cultivate the relationships that were necessary to win out at the end. For a while, again, she was able to build, again, strong bonds with Zara and Kristen that seemed pretty undying. The fact that she saved Logan and Logan instantly flips on her, the fact that she, again, just makes it so obvious to AJ that she's against him, I think those are major issues in her game to where, while I think she definitely has some strong suits, definitely has some negatives, but ultimately lands here number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that I'm surprised is at number 7. And to be fair, it's probably more so because of the flaws of the other players, where I think on paper, I actually would think that Karin is a better player than this person. Yeah, I think I have more major criticisms with Karin than this person. So at number 7, I do have Kristen. Now, Kristen, again, to me is a very tough player to assess because, again, unlike Karin, who was in the majority the entire time, Kristen was very rarely in a majority group. I knew she was largely safe throughout the entire season. There's actually very few points where Kristen was even mentioned as a target throughout the entire season, which, considering the fact that, again, she was towards the bottom of the pecking order, I think is pretty impressive. So again, she starts off the game in Nash's group, again, alongside Ursula, and despite that, again, there's never talk about putting the vote onto Kristen, where it seemed like she was just a very affable presence, someone that people liked, people that just wanted to keep around. She obviously gets to swap in a spot where, again, she also is very safe. There's never talk about putting votes onto Kristen. It seemed like, again, Paulie and Nunan was a target ahead of her, Ursula was a target ahead of her, and it seemed like AJ genuinely wanted to work with her at that point. Mind you, I think an issue is the fact that she never wanted to work with AJ and made it very open to AJ that she was not really wanting to work with him, which again is definitely a criticism there, but again, still remained very safe throughout that portion of the game, and then gets their merge where she once again is able to still maintain these relations that she built to swap to be within this majority group. I knew, again, not particularly high on the pecking order, but again is able to reestablish her bond with PD. While PD goes at the second tribal after the merge, she obviously gets screwed over by Knowledge's power in that spot. Even beyond that, again, stays in the majority while, again, not really having influence in the Logan vote. Still is involved in that vote going through, and went down to only 5 targets during the Baron Bounty round. She ends up avoiding that target there with both Paulie and Logan not taking her out. Again, still remains in the majority during the Karin boot round, while obviously, again, she tries to save Karin. Karin blows it up. I'm not really going to criticize Kristen for making that move, as again, I think that was the move to make. I think, again, obviously keeping around Karin is better for her than Zara. So while it obviously blew up in her face, I do think she at least had the right strategic idea in that spot. And also, but beyond that, obviously, again, almost gets to a rock draw, had half the tribe on her side during the Logan boot round, and obviously, again, makes the wrong call not going to rocks, but still ultimately, again, survives the final 8 where she had half the tribe on her side, gets to the final 7 spot where Kate and Morgan still stick by her, which I think is pretty impressive. For a while, again, it was very unlikely she was going to be able to flip another vote there. I do feel like, again, there's a lot of good work from Kristen across the season. I feel like she's a very affable social presence. She was, again, able to avoid being targeted for really the entire season up until the final 7. And even then, again, it's a spot where it feels like her game kind of blows up on her because of Karin messing up more than her actively doing anything wrong in that specific position. Where, again, while I do think at the end of the day, Kristen's end game was one that was a little bit rocky, I don't know how she actually gets to the end without some level of winning out. And again, it's just very clear that she simply did not know the game well enough to really be able to think of these more optimal situations for her. I do feel like Kristen still had a lot of potential and was able to really avoid being targeted for most of the game. Where really at the end of the day, for me, again, it's very close between her and Karin. And again, Karin probably had more influence in the game. Karin was in the majority for more of the game. And again, I think in the debate between her and Kristen, I do feel like Kristen one outlasts her in a spot where, again, she literally gave Karin the lifeline and Karin just didn't take it. But also, I feel like Kristen faced off against a lot more adversity and was able to still maintain her position within the majority group despite that. Where I think there's, again, more nitpicks to be had with Karin's game despite the fact that she was on top than Kristen. To where the fact that Kristen also ends up outlasting Karin by the end, I think it is enough to put Kristen here at number 7, though again, it is pretty marginal. Now number 6, we're moving on to a player that I find very difficult to rank here. This is a player that we just simply did not see much of. Did not seem to have much of a chance of winning the game, but just simply based on positioning throughout most of the game. At number 6, I'm going to go Morgan. Now again, I think you very much debate this considering Morgan, again, seemed to have no chance of winning the game. Seemed like no one really respected Morgan. It seemed like she was the biggest goat on the board. Mind you, again, there were some behind the scenes aspects to that. The fact that she didn't want to be there, and the fact that there's supposedly this incident that caused all that, to where I definitely sympathize with Morgan in terms of that. But in terms of the actual game, again, Morgan was someone that, again, simply could not win. Also did not seem to be doing particularly well in challenges. So again, obviously there's a question of, like, was she trying? But again, I assume she was. So again, because of that, despite how, like, physical of a presence she is, she's someone that wasn't really targeted because, again, no one really looked at her as a threat. And that's obviously a dichotomy that is, again, tough to wrap my head around here when, again, she couldn't win the game by the end. But her positioning throughout the game is pretty good. Again, she's working alongside Kate for most of the season. He's literally side by side with her as she's making all the moves. Mind you, we do see Kate doing a lot more of the legwork typically, where we very rarely see Morgan do a lot of the strategizing here. But to be fair, that's because Morgan's edit was very small. But I do think in most cases, Morgan is a pretty competent player. Now, she did get confrontation at points. That wasn't ideal, particularly in her kind of blasting those when she was on the bottom, where, again, I think she was kind of over it by that point, but still not optimal gameplay. But again, in terms of how she maneuvered through the game, again, she was right in the middle for most of the season. Again, she was hard to flip against Candy, and mind you, I will definitely qualm with the decision to take out Candy. I don't think that was really the right call there to turn against all your alliance members for that, but still, she still did that. She was still on the right side for that first vote, and then was able to integrate herself back into the majority. Again, despite the fact that Nash then proceeds to target her, she's still able to have all these allies that she literally just flipped on still side with her that following vote, stays in that majority throughout the post-swap phase. And while, again, I definitely do question if she should have turned on Jesse, the fact that she was effectively able to turn on Jesse and get this vote onto him before the non-elim happened, I think is also very good for her. And then we get to the merge where, again, her and Kate should be these massive targets, and somehow they're not being targeted for a lot of the game. Mind you, again, she was a backup target coming into the tribal where you do get that Baron bounty vote, but again, it didn't seem like she was actually going home there, and really it seemed like she was pretty safe throughout that entire end game stretch. For a while, again, there are points where she didn't necessarily know what was happening. She was in the majority for really that entire time up until the final 8, where once the Logan vote happens, she's obviously just on the bottom from that point forward. But even then, she gets very unlucky in how she goes out. She's essentially screwed over by a twist. Mind you, again, I think it's a spot where she was already a dead man walking by that point anyway, but it's still a spot that screwed her over, making it further into the game, as really Kate should have gone at 6. Really, Morgan was there at 5. I think it's very likely that Morgan stays in the game, because at that point, Zara's not going to want to take Morgan out over the likes of AJ or Kaylin, where, and I do think that is a spot where Morgan probably had a lot of longevity in the game. I would not be shocked if Morgan somehow stumbles her way to final 2. Has she not been taken out final 6 there, which was by a twist, where, again, I think it's just a tough game to assess. I think her game is not particularly good based around the fact that, again, she just simply could not win at the end, and she did seem to make some, again, questionable strategic decisions and did not maintain the best relationships. But again, she still was able to navigate through most of the game while remaining in the majority, and does get kind of screwed over at the end. So for me, again, it's good enough to put her here number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to another player a little bit up in the air with, where they were kind of just like in and out of the majority at a lot of points in the game. Also questionable win equity, but still pretty competent player throughout all of it. And that player is Zara. And Zara, again, I think is a player that was actually able to maintain the majority for a lot of the season. The fact that she was initially in that Covenant Alliance, and while, again, they ended up having to vote out India at that first vote, and again, to be fair, Zara doesn't have much influence early on in the game, where her and Karn are not really getting their way and getting rid of Rich. They eventually do end up being the charge against Rich, only for it to obviously be a non-elim, but still, they do get their way at that point, while being in a alliance that had a lot of influence in the game. But again, alongside Karn, ends up doing very good work and building a parachute alliance, and ends up being in the graduates, to where they end up winning the day at the alley vote. After that, she ends up being screwed over by a swap, but even then ends up actually playing well enough to where it never seems like she's truly a target. And again, it seemed like she was the initial backup if they had gone the tribal initially, only for it to end up ultimately flipping to Max. She then also is the backup coming into that non-elim tribal, though to be fair, none of that was really real, as it was obviously always going to flip onto Jesse had that been a real tribal. And she does technically get voted out there, but again, she obviously asked to be voted out. Though I will say, I do question her overall handling of that situation. Really, just in general, I do very much question like how Zara treats people, where we see a lot of points where Zara's just like being very frank with people in spots where it's clearly going to turn them off, to where I don't think that's the greatest strat. And obviously in this Laura situation, I think she's really just burning social capital of Laura for no real reason, because considering they should still have the numbers without Laura on that side, and again, likely they're going to merge soon anyway, to where I don't think that was a fight worth fighting. It does end up putting a massive bullseye on her back. We do see the Bronze coming to the merge with the plan of targeting Zara because of this move, to where, again, I do think that was something that was not the optimal play, but still, she ends up maintaining the majority after the merge. Not leading any votes. She's still there stably in the majority up until the eventual Karin vote, which to fair is a point where, again, there were some people that actually want her out over Karin, so again, that is kind of bad. But again, she ends up recovering pretty well after that, while she ends up, again, getting into a deadlock. She ends up re-solidifying the graduates, and they end up really just running the show from that point forward. Now, ultimately, obviously, you can definitely qualm with some decisions she makes in the end game. Again, her taking out Morgan, I think, is a spot where that was kind of bad by the end. As again, that was one of the only people that she could actually beat at the end. Also, I think her decision to take out Kate at Final 5 is one that, again, I think is pretty ill-advised considering her lacking win equity at that point. And again, I felt like she needed a move to shake up the status quo. Yeah, instead, she's just taking out Kate and burning relationships on the way to where, again, did not think that was the greatest play either. Now, when we get to the Final 4, I do think Zara gets a bit unlucky in how everything plays out. Obviously, she was in a spot where she likely does stay had Miles not won immunity, and she gets very unfortunate in that, to where at that point, again, obviously AJ and Kaylin are going to be voting her out, and at that point also Miles ends up turning on her, which again, to be fair, is part of the negatives of her move at the Final 5 is that she's making a move that burns pretty much everyone in the game. So while she thinks she's gaining favor with the likes of AJ and Kaylin, they really don't really owe anything to her, and Miles is someone that is directly burned there, to where he's not going to put that much faith in Zara, to where, again, that's obviously a flaw there, but in general, I do feel like her exit from the game here is largely unlucky, but obviously it was a position that she was kind of further put in by the move that she made previously, where had she split up AJ and Kaylin at that point, she wouldn't really be in that position. But ultimately, again, I think another issue is the fact that she did intend on taking Miles to the Final 2, that she was not going to go with Kaylin, her only possible chance at winning scenario. She was instead going to go with one of the bigger threats on the board, and that's obviously an issue as well. And Zara is actually a player that I actually think plays probably a more stable game than the next person we'll be talking about, but the reason why she is below that person is simply win equity. I don't think she had the win equity at the end of War. While again, I think she was more stably in the majority. It was not in as much danger throughout the game as the next person we'll be talking about. That person, again, had a good chunk of win equity. So again, I think Zara is a player here that just kind of questionable game. Ups and downs throughout a lot of it. Though again, still makes the Final 4. And again, with very questionable win equity and again, with some questionable decision-making at points. But still makes it very deep into the game. Was actually in the majority for a lot of the game. And really, I think that's enough credit to give her to be here number 5. Now number 4. At number 4, moving on to what might end up being a controversial pick here. I think this is a spot where probably some people are going to disagree. But again, based on my assessment of the game, at number 4, I do have the winner of the season. I have Miles. Where I personally would rate Miles' winning game very low. I think Miles is a player that tries a lot of things, fails at a lot of things, also does rely on advantages at points. And again, I think, again, literally needing 2 idols to save himself in the game. Mind you, again, not the worst cases of needing idols in the world, but still. But again, Miles' winning game is one that I don't particularly assess very highly. But again, in comparison to my US list, he would be alongside the Ben Drebergens, the Rachel Lamonts of the world, and the fact that, again, I have them relatively low on the board. And straight up, I very much consider putting Miles lower. I think Miles is a player here that played a very sloppy game, and based on what my assessment of the game is, again, a game where I personally respect people that are more stably in the majority, people that are a lot more involved in what actually ends up happening on the season. I feel like, and people that play optimally to their best interests, I feel like Miles plays kind of a lacking game from that perspective. I think he makes and at least attempts to make moves that don't really make sense for his game. I think he is at many points in the game just kind of on the bottom. He is obviously saved by multiple advantages at points, and he did not really get his way for a lot of the season. Mind you, obviously, he made it to the end and won, and that is obviously the main thing putting him so high here, but I do feel like, again, there's a lot to nitpick with Miles' game here, to where I really struggle to put him higher on this list, and even, again, debated even this slot itself. But I will say, I don't think Miles is a bad player. Like, I think Miles is actually somebody that, again, is very active, is doing these things, and while, again, his success rate is very faulty, I think the fact that he at least has this gumption to make these big moves is something that would work out for him in a lot of cases. And while, again, I think there were definitely points where socially he made some questionable calls and how he would talk to people, I think he also, again, was still able to come off as endearing, kind of playing up how sneaky of a player he is. But again, it is still a game where he's kind of in and out of the majority. He obviously starts the game kind of on the bottom, being a backup target. During the Indy and Kent votes, he is then able to find himself in the bomb squad immediately afterwards, though even then, seemingly at the bottom of that alliance initially, though also ends up being part of the graduates. And again, his game does flip around by the end of that pre-swap, where again, he finds himself in this stable majority, ends up saving him over Allie in a spot where, again, he definitely could have been screwed over in that spot. Yet again, he ends up surviving there because of his relationships. I think that's definitely something to credit him for. And obviously, he ends up cultivating this good relationship with Kaylin and AJ, but obviously gets swapped away from them. And again, it gets a very disfortunate swap where he does end up finding an idol by stumbling upon it in a spot where he wasn't looking for it, where, again, I think that's definitely very questionable. But again, it's a spot where he needs an idol during that max boot round. It's pretty aloof to what's going on there, doesn't recognize that literally everybody's against him. but again, plays the idol correctly. So we're in a spot where I can't completely dock him in that position, considering the fact that I think he just got very unlucky in how the swap played out to begin with to be in that position. Mind you, again, I don't think it's a spot without fault, as again, there were obviously other options there, where the fact that he was the primary target in that spot is still definitely something to knock here. But again, beyond that, he's able to, again, reintegrate himself in the game. Again, he's able to get the target off his back and work with the men, and again, get really both sides wanting to work with him. Again, this Girls Gone Wild alliance ends up trying to pick him up as a number, while also the men end up looping him in and create the hunks, to where, again, Miles ends up being in a pretty good spot coming into the swap by that point, to where, again, where it felt like Zara and Laura and Jesse were just bigger targets than him by that point. And again, he's able to be in the majority coming into the merge, but that's when we, again, get some questionable play. Again, the PD vote is something that I do question if that was the correct call, mostly lean against it. Again, burning this relationship with Kristen, taking out PD, which again, while other people did want PD, it doesn't really gain him anything to get rid of PD in that spot. I think he would have had much better use using that knowledge as power to make an even bigger play down the road. Instead, he ends up pissing people off for no real reason. While he's not the immediate target the following round, where it did seem like Laura and Logan were bigger targets, and obviously we get Laura getting out in the following round, he's still in the spot where a lot of the players in the game did not want to work with him long term, where again we see him instantly being thrown under a bus when we get the Baron bounty twist. Mind you, again, I think that's another spot where while he did need his idol in that position to stay in the game, he still also is pretty unfortunate in how that plays out, with again only 5 people being eligible to be voted out in that position. But still, he was a consensus boot from both sides. I think that is something to definitely qualm with, even though he had the relationship with AJ, for AJ to loop him into the fact that he should be playing his idol. But that's also a spot where we start to get Miles again trying to make these like big maneuvers and just failing at them. Again, him trying to get Logan and Paulie to flip the vote on Kristen, and that ends up going nowhere, with him literally being the only person in on that plan by the end, which is pretty bad. We also see him starting to Karin boot round, him just being so aloof to what's going on and just stumbling his way into creating this like Zara plan that no one gets on board with, only be looped in on the Karin plan at the very last second. But again, following that, he's able to recover. Again, he's able to get back into graduates. They cause his 4-4 tie. He wins out at that point, and he has, again, a lot of influence over the next few rounds. The problem is that he's not playing particularly optimally. Again, he's ostracizing the people on the bottom. He's even annoying people in his majority, where again, he's annoying AJ by the fact that he's not willing to split the vote during the Kristen vote. So he does organize his Kaylin vote at final 6, only for it to be ordered by Kaylin winning immunity, so I won't really fault him too much for that. Especially when his like secondary target was Kate, and then Kate wins immunity at the last second, to where again, him not getting his way when Morgan goes out is not really a big ding there. But again, at final 5, that's a big ding, where he ends up creating this massive play to take out AJ, which again, I question the move to take out AJ. I don't think that was the right call for him, considering AJ was seemingly wanting to genuinely take him to final 3. But again, I can at least get the rationale there. But again, the fact that he even fails at a move that isn't even in his best interest and actually stumbles into one that I think is in his best interest of Kate going home is kind of funny there. Then we get to the final 4, which again, I think is a spot where he seemingly needs to win immunity. Even if he didn't, he needed to win a fire making challenge, survive that round. Either way, he was never going to cleanly get out of the final 4 round. And again, if it is a spot where he needed to win immunity there, that's obviously a major knock against him as well. In a spot where I do think he ultimately makes the right call in taking out Zara. I think that is what his optimal play was. But again, he initially didn't want to do that. And at final 3, obviously, like Kayla ends up voting out AJ over him. But again, I do question how much of that was active on Miles' end. Again, I think it's because Kaylin perceived AJ as the bigger threat that he would have a tougher time beating at the end, which again, I think was an accurate read. I think that was the correct call to take Miles to the end. I think Miles is someone that he has more of an argument against. To where again, I don't know how much of this was like manipulation for Miles, especially because we don't really see Miles do much here that seemingly really soaked in to convince Kaylin of this. To where, while I'll give him some credit for surviving the final 3 round, I still think it's a spot where we don't really see much of what he actively does to make this go through. That again just makes me think it's more so Kaylin making a decision on his own that benefited Miles than Miles actually doing anything to get this to go through. And really just in general, I think that is like the entire notion around his jury prospects as well. The fact that, again, I think on the island, seem to look at his jury prospects as very low. I don't think that was intentional for Miles. I think actually the opposite. I think if anything, he was actually trying to do the opposite and really play up how big of a threat he is, because it seemed like he did not have an understanding of what the jury thought of him, that he seemed to think he needed these big moves towards the end of the game when he didn't really need that. He already was looked at as the biggest jury threat alongside AJ, and him doing that was just risking his own game, to where I think that's also a negative on Miles' game here as well. For while again, he does demolish Kaylin at the end, I think he demolishes most people at the end. I think the only person he has a struggle beating at at the end is likely AJ. Again, maybe Kate, but even then, I still think he probably beats her. Again, I do think, again, against AJ, I think, again, it might be a little bit tight, but still, it's still a spot where, again, he beats almost everybody on the board. And again, that's why he's ranked as high as he is here. Again, that's the reason he's above Zara in particular, where I think Zara's navigation through the game is a lot more smooth. And I actually inherently would want to put Zara higher. Like, I think I would personally vote for Zara over Miles. However, I do think Miles, again, had that win equity in a spot where, again, I don't know how much it was necessarily earned, but again, he was going to win against most people on the board. And I think that is really the big decision maker here in comparison between him and Zara. Though, again, I just think his game is still just too sloppy to really put amongst the best of the best. And while, again, I think there are definitely reasons to excuse some of the sloppiness along the way, I still think the fact that, again, he is just seemingly so ineffective at so many points in the season, only be saved by things kind of out of his control. I feel like are things that definitely knock me on Miles's game. But again, ultimately, I just think Miles is a player here that, again, is skilled for the game. I think he definitely has some good attributes for the game. But again, he does still go on the win. He still does have a lot of influence at specific points in the game. And he did seem to manage his threat level pretty well. No one really looked at him as this big jury threat at the end. So despite me thinking his game is bad, again, his win equity towards the end, and again, him being able to execute on a couple moves along the way, despite me, again, not thinking that a lot of them are in his best interest, is, again, enough to put him here at number 4. Now number 3, and now we're moving on to a player that I actually think is probably more in line to the likes of Zara and Morgan, but the real thing that props this person up is their win equity, where I think this is the most likely winner of that grouping. I also think this is a person that in general seemed to be a pretty big jury threat. While I do think it's a struggle for actually see them get to final 2, I think there's a player that had things swung a certain way. I think they're a very likely winner, and that person is Kate. And I think really her game and Morgan's are not that dissimilar. Again, they seemingly played a very similar game, worked alongside each other, made the same moves. While we see Kate being a little bit more active, and Kate obviously got a bigger edit on the show, I don't feel like Kate is somebody that did too much better than Morgan, outside the fact that she could win a jury vote. And again, in comparison to Zara, I think she was definitely a bigger jury threat than Zara. Again, because that, again, I think Kate ends up leapfrogging her to where, again, Kate is a player that also, again, was in the majority of the entire season, also made, again, the same moves as Morgan, flipped against Candy at that first vote, was able to stay in the majority following that, not a target, following that, like Morgan, who was targeted by Nash. So again, that's a little credit to her. Again, at the swap, we see her being the one to split the vote onto Max, which is very beneficial for her, along with her also leading the charge against Jesse, which again, I don't think is the right call for her, but again, she at least still is able to get those votes together. And again, I think her ultimately taking out Jesse at the merge was very questionable. It did seem like she did very good work in building a spot on AJ to where AJ wants to keep her around. And while, again, she was talked about as a potential target by the time of like the final 10, it did seem like, again, that relationship with AJ and the fact that, again, people just targeting Karin over her, something that would have benefited her anyway. But it really all comes down to the final 8 round, where obviously had they won it out, Kate is a very likely winner in that spot. Mind you, I don't think Kate was ever going to go to Rocks there, and she simply obviously didn't know what Rocks was. And to be fair, I don't even know if I necessarily agree with going to Rocks for Kate in particular, where I think Kate at least has more leeway with AJ to where, again, I think there would at least be a reason for her to not go to Rocks in that spot, though probably was the correct call ultimately. But again, somehow she's not targeted at Final 7. I'll say that's kind of impressive considering like how. But obviously she would have been taking out Final 6 had she not won immunity in a last second immunity competition. So again, that's something to definitely dock her a bit for. And also, again, was unwilling to vote out Morgan, which that's also pretty bad as well. Though I will say at Final 5, I don't think she necessarily does too much wrong. To a while, and Kate was a pretty big target on the board and definitely still had people that wanted her out. I do feel like she does seemingly come relatively close to staying, in the sense that Miles did generally want to keep her around, and Kaylin seemed to generally want to take Miles out, to where, again, there were at least like enough people that didn't directly want her out, so I'll give her like some credit there, especially considering how big of a jury threat she was. It seemed like the jury adored her and were very much rooting for her on the jury, to where, again, I would not be shocked if Kate were somehow get to the end that she would have won against anybody. Mind you, I don't think she really had a path there outside of winning out. For a while, I think some people were willing to take her to 4. I don't think anyone was willing to take her 3. Obviously, this looming threat over her being good at endurance challenges was definitely something that was being brought up constantly across the season, which again made her endgame path very rocky, especially without a particularly close ally in the end game. I think Kate as a whole is, again, a competent player. Mind you, one that I don't necessarily agree with the decisions she made in the game. And I think a lot of that came down to the fact that I don't think she knew the game particularly well. And I think if she had come into the game with a bit more game knowledge, I think she probably would have at least had a cleaner end game. But again, I still think the fact that she was, again, so willing to play the game so aggressively was something that was refreshing to see here. In a spot where, again, while I don't agree with the decisions she made, and again, flipping against Candy, her turning against Jesse, I at least do respect the gusto she had there, and the fact that she was actually able to get those things done. Or again, it's not like she attempted to do these things and failed at them. She was actually able to execute on these moves. So while I disagree with the decisions that she made, she still had the influence to make these things happen. And again, the big difference here between Miles and Kate for me is the fact that I think Kate was just more stably in the majority for most of the season. While I also disagree with certain decisions that she ends up making, those decisions did not put her in danger. Where Miles was in danger constantly throughout the season, was on the bottom, was constantly getting votes, again, literally was saved by 2 idle plays along the way. Kate is someone that was more stably in the majority the entire way, and I do think because of that, and also her, again, seemingly having a decent amount of win equity, and also, again, if that final 8 round went in the other direction, I think Kate becomes the most likely winner. I think all those things amount to Kate being here number 3. Now number 2, and again, the top 2 here should be obvious at this point. I had a big debate between these two, as I think one was more stable throughout a lot of the game. The other one had a lot more direct influence in the game, to where ultimately my decision here ended up coming down to win equity. And at number 2, I do have Kaylin. And again, Kaylin, I think, is a player here that is naturally skilled for the game. Again, the fact that he is so physical and obviously breaks the record for immunity wins is impressive in that light. He seemed to be very affable socially, where no one disliked Kaylin throughout the entire season. And he also had a pretty sharp strategic mind for the game. Mind you, obviously a big portion of his game is the fact that he was keeping that all secret, that he was downplaying his threat level, that he was playing dumb. And again, I think he falls into this trap that we see on other reality shows of people just doing so too much, to where, again, threat management is very important in the game of Survivor, where, again, if you're too big of a threat, people are going to take you out before the end. However, I think the problem with Kaylin is that he took that to the extreme. And again, I very much compare Kaylin to someone like Godfrey from BB Can 3, of this player that, again, while we know that they are very intelligent players, that they are intentionally playing down their threat level, they're doing so to the point where just no one actually believes them when they end up revealing their intentionality in the game. And I feel like Kaylin, again, just goes too hard into playing dumb, to the point where we just see so many people talking about how actually dumb of a player he is. And I think it's not helped by the fact that other people around him, especially even in the end game, are playing much harder around him, to where it gives off the impression that they're the ones making all these calls, when obviously Kaylin has a portion of play in that as well. And I do think Kaylin, again, has a very impressive game. Again, the fact that he makes most of the season without getting a single vote against him, despite being this big physical threat, is very impressive. Again, I think the way that he manages threat level is insane, considering, again, he is this type of player that goes on to break the record for immunity wins. So where, while again, it didn't really seem like he had like a big solid alliance early on, where he was just kind of right in the middle, he was really well positioned on the original Brains tribe, eventually builds his bond with Miles and AJ, ends up being part of the graduates, while also being part of Logan's alliance at that point, again, kind of just right in the middle, though ultimately picks the graduate side by the end. At the swap, again, maintains in the majority and is able to really corral the Brains together, where we see, again, the likes of Logan and Karin wind up flip against AJ, and the same thing the other way around. And we really see Kaylin being the one to stop all that from happening. And again, I think that is something I would give Kaylin a lot of credit for. And again, once we get to merge, he's in the majority really the entire time. Mind you, again, he doesn't really have much gumption in the game. He's not really doing much actively to steer the votes early on. But again, he does, despite the fact that he, again, is in the losing side of the Baron Bounty twist, and there's only 5 people eligible to be voted out, he was never talked about as a potential target. The only person there that was never talked about as a potential target. And I think that is something that's pretty impressive, considering his positioning. Now, the show ends up giving him a lot of credit for the Karin vote, in a spot where, again, he clearly did want Karin out. I do think it probably gave him a little bit too much credit, as, again, it's not like AJ would never have wanted Karin out if it wasn't for Kaylin, or it's not like Kaylin was like planting these seeds and this is finally the time to make the move. It's just naturally, it just felt like that was the time to make the move. But still, he ends up obviously winning the day at the final 8, and ends up, again, being in the majority after that. But though, again, does have a kind of tumultuous endgame stretch. Again, at final 6, it did seem like he was probably going to go had he lost immunity there. I also do question his decision to take out Kristen at 7, where I think that's a spot where Kristen was someone that was more loyal to him than the other people in his alliance. I think he should have been fighting more to try to get rid of Kate in that spot. Also at 6, when he gets out Morgan, I think that's also a bad play, considering Morgan's one of the few people that he can win against. And I think him getting rid of Morgan at that point essentially like really ended up sinking his game, really narrowing his options, to where beyond that, at final 5, it seemed like he was very ripe to be taken out and didn't really get a save due to really anything that he particularly did. So while I do think he, again, ends up swinging the vote on Miles, I think that is a good play if he had the numbers. The reality is that he just simply did not have the numbers, and really all came down to what Zara did, where again, Zara literally wanted him out the previous rounds, and it didn't really feel like Kaylin did much to actually save himself there. Now, final 4, again, I think is another point where, like, Kaylin is able to remain safe. Again, like, no one's voting for Kaylin during that round. Again, AJ refuses to vote for him. Zara attempts to put the votes on him, but again, just simply goes nowhere. And again, I think that is impressive from Kalen. The problem, obviously, is the fact that I think he makes the wrong call if he wants to win the game. Again, he makes the right call in terms of getting to Final 2, where again, by taking Miles and AJ to Final 3, he essentially guarantees that he's going to be in the Final 2. The problem is that he's also guaranteeing his loss, as he can't win against either of them. And while I get that he had this idea of popping up at Final Tribal and explaining his entire game, again, it's something that, again, just is never going to be effective when the jury is already very pro the other option, to where I think for Kalen, again, his call here to take out Zara at Final 4 is really a game-ending move. And while, again, I think it's very impressive, his maneuvering through the game at that point, I think, obviously, that was just the wrong call for his game, even though, again, it puts him in a precarious spot at Final 3 for sure. But, again, it's really his only winning trajectory at that point. But, again, he gets to Final 3 in a spot where, again, he wins Final Immunity. I, again, once again, criticize the fact that, again, he very much struggles with the decision openly from the jury. I don't think that helps his jury chances, though. It's not like that really would have mattered anyway. But, again, votes at AJ, which is the correct call. And, to be fair, that's another reason why Kalen is so high on this list, is because, again, I think he makes that right call at the end. Again, he had that killer instinct to cut his number one ally. The problem is that it just simply was not enough. And I think he just, again, miscalculated his opponent. I don't think he recognized how big of a jury threat Miles was at the end, which really ends up sinking Kalen's game. But in general, again, I think Kalen is a very impressive player. I think his navigation through game is nearly spotless. Again, Final 6 round is definitely very rocky. But really outside that, again, I think he plays a very impressive game to not be targeted the entire time, is in the know of every little thing that's happening, and also is somebody that's, again, in AJ's ear as he makes decisions, to where, again, I think as a whole, Kalen plays a very impressive game here. The real big issue here is win equity, where if he had win equity, he would be number one. I think he plays such a clean game, a cleaner game than the next person we'll be talking about, but again, it is that lack of win equity at the end that kind of sinks him, which is why he's here number 2. Now, number 1, the best player of Australian Survivor, Brains versus Brawn II, ends up being AJ. And again, I think at the end of the day, I would have debated him and Kalen. I think they both were in the majority for almost the entire season, were in the know what was going on for most of the season. But again, I think AJ is the more active player. AJ was the one that had the influence to actually make these moves go through, though also was, again, in a bit more danger than Kalen. And that's the big debate there. To again, I think it kind of evens them out a bit, to where ultimately the thing that gives AJ the lead here is win equity. Again, I think AJ, if he gets to the end, I think he likely wins. Definitely wins against Kalen, where again, I think the jury just respected AJ's game more than Kalen's. I think that was definitely a deciding factor there. Where outside that, again, their games are not that dissimilar, considering they were working together the entire time. And while obviously AJ has these harebrained schemes at points, AJ was seemingly pretty effective in the game. I mean, to be fair, we do start off with him again failing to get rid of Logan during the Kent vote off, in a spot where again he kind of overextended, and I do think he fails at getting Allie on his side, and that's obviously bad. Though at the same time, I do think the fact that it doesn't fall back on him is pretty impressive. I think he obviously specifically did that move pretty late in the day, so that couldn't fall back on him. And again, I think there is some decent play there, though obviously again he did not have the influence at that point, but then ends up getting the influence through telling Rich a lie and ends up flipping Rich on Laura and Logan. I think that's a very impressive play there, to where despite the fact that Logan, again, one of the more influential players at that point, knowing that AJ was against her, she still was not able to get him out at that if that falling vote went through. And it obviously ends up being part of the graduates, to where they end up leading the alley vote. And obviously he does end up getting a very fortunate swap, but I do think he plays the swap initially very well. Again, he's the one that's able to play all sides. Ozzy still has his original brains, but then also is able to cultivate this relationship with Rich initially, to where it seemed like they were in this swing position, while also building bonds with the Brawns. Again, he builds a bond with Paulie and Nunan. He builds a bond with Kristen, and while again, it ultimately doesn't work in his favor by the end, it did seem like AJ was doing a lot of good work to set himself up in the middle of that tribe, though ultimately ends up voting out Rich, where Rich is a pretty unstable presence. And to be fair, I think it's a decent move considering his connections with the Brawns anyway. Again, it still just fully puts himself in the middle, though kind of individually at that point. And then we also get to the Ursula vote, which I also think was the correct call for him. Again, keeping Paulie and Nunan, keeping around Kristen, but also obviously this is the point where he creates the hostage plan. And I think that is the spot where it's a bit more debatable. Again, I actually don't think the hostage plan is fundamentally bad, especially in the way that he handles it initially. The fact that he is, again, looping the Brawn in, telling them that I'm not actually planning on getting rid of you. I'm just going to pretend like I am. And again, I think that is very good. And I think there's a lot of logic in play here. The problem is that you also need your own allies on board. And obviously, again, his own allies were not on board with this plan. Also, again, it's kind of throwing the Brains on the other side under the bus as well. So again, I do think there is some fallacies in his logic, but I do think there are a lot of upsides to this move, to where I don't actually think it's fundamentally bad, as long as you can get your entire tribe on board with it, which again, simply didn't. But again, even despite that, they don't turn on him right away here. It's really not until the Nunan boot where he ends up playing his idol that Karin ends up turning against him. But even then, he's able to get his way there, get all the votes onto Paulie, though obviously Paulie ends up playing the idol taking out Nunan. Though obviously along the way, again, he does mismanage his relationship with Nunan to where Nunan lashes out at him. Same thing with Paulie, to where again, obviously Kristen never really trusted him, to where again, his relationships with the other side start to disintegrate. But again, he's still able to maintain his majority there. And it did seem like he was going to have a pretty easy Paulie vote out when Ben ended up quitting the game. Mind you, again, Karin did come with this plan to split the vote onto him, which is so dumb. But still, AJ was not going home there, and AJ ends up maintaining a majority coming into the merge, while also, again, building good relationships with Kate and Morgan. Seemingly was starting to build a relationship PD, and it did seem like AJ was, again, very good at building these connections. He ends up being one of the only people looped in on the PD vote, which, again, I don't think that was the right call for AJ in particular, but again, he's still involved in that plan. Obviously, he leads the charge against Logan and Laura, and while Karin ends up ruining his plan by telling Laura to play her idol, he still technically got the majority of the players in the game to go his way. Obviously, rats out Miles' plan during the Baron Bounty round to have Miles play the idol, and again, does very effective work in separating himself from Miles. Again, despite the fact that him and Miles were looked at as a duo, he does very good work at making them not look like a duo and really taking this target off their backs. And so obviously leading the charge against Karin the following round, ends up getting her out. Plays the rock draw round very well, where his side was always going to be winning side there, and he gets rid of his biggest threat in Logan. Takes out Kristen at 7, which I think is also a very good call for him. Again, keeping around Kate and Morgan, who he has better connections to. Ultimately gets his way during the Morgan vote, mind you, again, sure enough, where again, that's really just simply because of a last second immunity win. But again, I think getting rid of Morgan in that spot is not bad for him. I think it's getting rid of a potential GOAT for the end. Also keeps around Kate, who's a shield for him. Now, I will say, I do question getting rid of Kate at 5. I think if I'm AJ, I think I probably actually target Zara during that round, but to be fair, again, she had immunity, so it wouldn't have been able to go through anyway. But again, I think for AJ, who's like one of the biggest threats on the board, someone that needs a lot of shields around him, I think Zara was the smallest shield for him at that point, to where I think she would have been the optimal play. But again, it doesn't end up mattering anyway. But again, it is a spot where he's blindside there, and a spot where again he was a dead man walking, where Zara had all the control in that spot, and if Zara wanted him out, he would have been gone. But again, it doesn't really feel like he's saved because of Zara's connection to him, but more so because of her being threatened by Kate. To where again, while I will credit him for again being able to keep Kate in the game for that long, he shouldn't have, at the least of what happened in Final 6. Ends up saving him just kind of out of the blue, to where he was just largely unaware of what was going on there. But then we get to the Final 4 round, where again, I think he plays it well based on his current read of the game. And to be fair, again, I think he was in a spot where he was kind of screwed no matter what because of Miles winning immunity, where his optimal play probably was to take out Miles at that point. For a while, I think there's obviously the risk that Kayla and Zara take each other. That obviously ended up being what happened with Miles there as well, to where again, I think him taking out Miles at 4 would have actually put him in probably a better standing at 3, especially with Zara, where I think Zara would have at least considered taking AJ to the end. Again, I think he gets unlucky that Miles wins immunity there, and then ultimately votes out Zara, and he was really putting all of his chips on Kaylin being the one to drag him to the end in a spot where, again, probably shouldn't have. But also, to be fair, with Miles there, obviously Zara and Miles had a pact as well, to where again, it's really just a spot where he's screwed either way. But then he gets to Final 3 where he's voted out by Kaylin, in a spot where again he was looked at as the biggest jury threat, and a spot where again, that is definitely one of the bigger criticisms of his game, is the fact that he was not able to hide how big of a jury threat he was, where it does seem like if AJ got to the end, I think he demolishes pretty much everybody but Miles, and Miles is again a close vote. So again, I do think AJ was clearly one of the biggest jury threats of the season, but again, he was just not able to hide that, and I think the fact that Kaylin, again, his number one ally, cuts him at the end here, again, is showing that lack of threat management from AJ's end. Also beyond that, I think AJ was also a player that seemed to be largely kind of like dragged to the end to a degree. I mean, while I do think, again, he had a lot of impressive play along the way, and again, there were points where people were targeting him, specifically Miles in that end game. I do think there was also this kind of notion out there of the fact that AJ is someone that we could just take the Final 3 and cut him there, where again, I think that was definitely a notion in Kaylin, Miles' minds at points, where while Miles doesn't follow through with that. Again, I think that is definitely something to note here in terms of how he got to Final 3, which again, I think is part of the meta of Australian Survivor at this point, to drag a player that won't do well in endurance challenges to the Final 3 to cut them at the end. But again, that doesn't really dock from AJ's game. Ultimately, AJ, I think, is a very good player on this season. I think while his plans definitely come off very scatterbrained, and it feels like from watching the show that a lot of the way that he operates is very see-through, it seemed very effective on the island, and he was able to keep a massive grouping of allies around him constantly, and I think he made mostly sound decisions in the game, with him having a very rational strategic mind most of the time, where again, I think AJ is a very solid player here, one that seemed to have a lot of win equity at the end, where again, I think he had more win equity than someone like Kaylin, had a lot more direct influence in the game, and honestly just was a lot more stable in the game than someone like Miles, where while Miles also had influence at points and ultimately wins the day against AJ, I do feel like AJ is still a player that was just more consistent throughout the entirety of it, which is why AJ's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn II. Now, obviously, we're already in the preseason. Faye versus the world. It's in a spot where I did not realize we'll be getting all this so soon. To where, again, expect a preseason power ranking for A vs. the World at some point in the near future. Now, again, it won't be immediate considering I do have other videos that need to come out a bit sooner, but I would say at some point in May, expect my A vs. the World video, and obviously when the season ends up wrapping up, I'll be doing a review and player ranking of that season as well. Also, this is the year where I planned on doing my ranking of every Australian Survivor player. Mind you, A vs. World's kind of messed with that. So again, my initial plan was for it to be coming out like midsummer, but now that A vs. World's happening, it has to be delayed a bit, so it probably won't be until towards the end of the year at this point. But anyway, I still do intend on doing that at some point down the road. Also, considering it's been 5 years since my original season winner rankings for AU, I'll be redoing my videos on that. Also, beyond that, obviously, I got a Challenge All-Star Rivals review coming out hopefully after this. Again, I didn't start working until very late, so hopefully we'll be done in time. Also, beyond that, obviously, we got Amazing Race 37. I'll be doing a review of Survivor 48. Obviously, I'll be doing coverage of when that season ends as well. And outside of that, obviously, just expect more of the typical style of content from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.